Well, Chad, fabulous work, fascinating.
Thank you.
Before we get into talking about the city itself, I just wanted to also start by asking you about how this whole project came to be, how you got interested in it, how you found out about it, how the movie came to be, how long you worked on it. Just let's talk about the production part of it before we get into this content.
So about, I'd say 4 years ago now, I was very interested in a topic called retrofuturism. So this is what people in the past used to think the future would look like. So kind of the iconic example is like the Jetsons, right? I came across, while researching that, I came across this comic strip by Athelstan Spilhaus called Our New Age, which is kind of an iconic example of retrofuturism. And so, you know, when you're a filmmaker, you're always looking for something with good visuals, right? So like a comic strip, it's fantastic visuals. It turns out that Our New Age is in the public domain, which means I can use it for free. And so there are all sorts of side benefits associated with telling a story about Athelstan Spilhaus, outside of the fact that he's just a really interesting thinker. And while researching Spilhaus, I came across something on Wikipedia, on his Wikipedia page called the Minnesota Experimental City. And I'm originally from Minnesota. And so, you know, this kind of captured my attention. And then, of course, the experimental city part, that's a whole other thing. And I'm like, what is this? A gentleman had written his dissertation on the project. And so I kind of got an idea of the scope of this thing. It's going to cost $10 billion. It's going to fix, you know, the American city that was struggling in the 1960s, which is a topic I'm very interested in. And it was going to do it with the newest, bestest technologies of the day, all emanating out of the head of this fascinating character named Athelstan Spilhaus, which the name itself, you know. So between all of those, I was just like, I was absolutely captivated, and I didn't even realize the depth of the archival materials that existed out there. I just knew I wanted to tell that story. And
a lot of materials here at the university in the archives.
Absolutely, yeah. The University Archive and the Northwest Architectural Archive. I listened to 160 hours of audio that was housed here at the various archives, and it was incredible because, you know, like I had learned a fair amount from reading about this city, but then when you actually dig into those materials, you know, those materials that many of them haven't been listened to in like 50 years, and you hear, you know, all of a sudden Athelstan Spilhaus and Bucky Fuller get in an argument over the experimental nature of the city. You know, it's just amazing. And so, you know, that's one of the great resources that you all have here is just an archive that collects and stores and curates all these wonderful materials. We're very fortunate.
So start to finish, how long did it take?
It took, let's see, we actually made our first visit for the film up here at the archives. We started that in February of 2015. And we completed it right before our premiere in Chicago in October of 2017. So about 2.5 years of production. But then there was another 6 months before that where we kind of had to vet the story, make sure that we could actually tell this story. And so that actually takes a fair amount of time. So 3 years is typically how long it takes me to make a documentary. So this one as well.
I first became aware of your work with the Pruitt-Igoe myth, the documentary you did on that public housing project in St. Louis that was torn down. And that was what, 2011 or so?
Right.
And so you clearly have an interest in big projects from the 60s. And so what are your thoughts about that project and this project, and what kind of relationships do you see there?
When one looks for continuities in one's career, it's always perhaps a trap. So I don't like to speculate too much as to what motivates me. I'm drawn to big ideas, I think. And so, you know, Pruitt-Igoe, even though for those of you who've seen it, you know it's not really a film about architecture or design, but I approached it from an architecture and design vantage point. That's how most people, I think, find out about Pruitt-Igoe as this kind of grand failure of modernist architecture. And that was a big, important idea for me, at least when I started the project, the idea that the built environment could in some sense shape the social reality that takes place inside it. I found out that, as we told in the film, we interpreted that story in a much broader way, looking at the kind of the legislation and the segregation that existed within St. Louis and, you know, all of these other factors. But ultimately what drove me to that project was this kind of central idea of architecture and design shaping the lives of people. in the same way here, when I found something like the experimental city, the big idea, as it kind of was laid out in Todd Wildermuth's dissertation, was the idea of this kind of conflict that existed within the environmental movement. Mm-hmm. You know, and that was the idea of like approaching environmentalism from a technological standpoint versus like technology is the bad guy, we need to step away from that. And that was a big kind of captivating idea as well. So I'm typically looking for like one of those big ideas, at least when I get into the project, as something that kind of I can drive towards as I make the film. Even if it doesn't ultimately end up in the film,
right.
You know, that's the thing that kind of leads you on that journey initially, and that's the important part. But you know, what I found interesting about the experimental city vis-a-vis Pruitt-Igoe is, so Pruitt-Igoe is all about what was called the 1960s urban crisis, so all the things that led to the decline of the American inner city in the 1960s. And the experimental city was a true attempt, a radical attempt to try to solve those kinds of problems. And, you know, that to me was absolutely captivating. So that's where I see a continuity, I guess, between the two works.
Right. Also, both of them are about sort of experts thinking that they have the solution for people, be they rural people, as in Aiken County, or poor people, as in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And that idea of people feeling as if they're being experimented on was the problem with both of these efforts, don't you?
To a certain extent, yeah, to a certain extent. I think that, you know, certainly in the experimental city's case, I think the word experimental meant something maybe a little bit different when the project was proposed, and the shifting sands of history underneath that word made it so that that word became very, very suspicious by the early to mid 1970s. So, you know, something that was kind of like optimistic, we're going to solve cities through experimentation, you know, and we see a lot of that discussion today, even that similar kind of language people will use. But by the early 1970s, the idea of like, you know, like putting guinea pigs into an experiment was like something that was deeply, deeply disconcerting to people, especially like with the kind of mistrust of government that arose during the time because of the Vietnam War and, you know, then Watergate and all these things. So, you know, the experimental city was kind of caught in those shifting sands, I think, in some way that made the name of the city problematic. You know?
Right, yeah. There's a wonderful part in the movie where you see Buckminster Fuller starting to push back against Spilhaus. And so let's just talk about some of the enormous egos in the characters from Spilhaus to Scylla to Bucky Fuller. And in those kind of interactions, you've listened to all those tapes. How did they all manage to stay in the same room together?
Well, you know, they got along like most people. These are intelligent people who like are professionals, and so I mean, obviously, like in the film, we're going to pick out the most dramatic parts too.
Right,
you know?
right.
That's just the very nature of drama, as you try to find those moments to kind of hinge your scene on.
But Bucky seemed to be questioning Spilhaus's idea of calling it an experimental city.
Absolutely.
He was trying to find another name for it that didn't, right?
Absolutely, yeah. He was concerned with it. You know, a lot of people were concerned with the name, but Bucky most especially. Now, it's funny, Bucky actually changed his mind on this. So Buckminster Fuller, as you see his development in the steering committee meetings, by the end of, so somebody who's deeply suspicious of like the kind of experimental, constantly changing city, by the early 1970s in the audio recordings, he's like kind of praising the idea of experimentation and the name. And he actually looks back on this argument that took place in the 1960s, and he said, you know, I have since come to like view this as a positive thing, and all the talks that I go do to various people around the world, when they hear the word experiment, now he was obviously maybe talking to different people than Swatera, but when they hear the word experiment, you know, they view it as an optimistic thing, as something that, you know, can really change. So, you know, depending on your audience at the time, it depended on how people took it. But certainly Buckminster Fuller was somebody who I think eventually was kind of won over by that idea of experimentation. Whether or not it would have worked, who knows? But yeah.
There's something almost Shakespearean about Spilhaus, though, isn't there? I mean, he was this visionary person who was somehow blind to his own flaws. And he ends up almost in a kind of tragic figure where he never saw these visions realized. Do you see that with him?
You know, what I see when I look at Spilhaus is I see somebody who, at the top of his game in the 1960s, believed very deeply in a particular worldview that science and technology could solve the deepest of humankind's issues. And In a way that's, there's a kind of naivety. I would never like call Spilhaus naive. I mean, the man was not naive by any means, but like there's a, like when we look back on that idea, we kind of tend to look at that with a certain amount of skepticism, I think. Most people in the audience would be my guess. And so I look at him as, and this is how I generally tend to look at people. I tend to look at it not as kind of an internal thing with him, but I look at him as kind of staying almost roughly consistent, and then the world around him kind of changing. And so like his kind of vision, that kind of vision that he preferred was one that, might have been very popular in the early to mid 1960s.
Right.
And he never really changed that much, but the world changes around him, and you see his growing aggravation at that world shifting, and it's out of his control.
Right.
So I feel a kind of pity for him, as it goes along, where he really sees that the kind of vision and the future that he envisioned when he was in the prime of his career as something that the world no longer wants,
Right.
or has any need for whatsoever.
Right.
And that's kind of how I view Spilhaus, and that kind of tragic kind of ending at the end. It's very sad to me.
Yeah, it's very
it's
powerful. When we were talking before, you mentioned that his very first comic was about climate change. So he was also a very prescient person. I mean, he was looking ahead to zero waste future, a future where we would have to deal with climate change. And so his visions were, in many ways, spot on, weren't they?
Yeah. And so, like, I don't know if the audience is privy to this. So, like, the very first Our New Age, if you were to go back to the 1958 Our New Age, it is actually explaining the mechanism for carbon dioxide released from fossil fuels, how that accumulates in the atmosphere, and how that warms up the atmosphere. And the very last panel of the very first Our New Age is New York City underwater after the ice caps have melted.
And this was 58.
58, he's talking about that. So yeah, I mean, he was all over the map. Now, like one thing that we should always keep in mind about climate change back in the day was that scientists they knew that humankind was changing the atmosphere. They didn't quite know which direction it would go.
Right.
So like Spilhaus also had a comic about the atmosphere cooling because of climate change, because of the particulates in the air. And it wasn't until like the mid 1980s that we started to gather enough data. So Spilhaus, like many scientists at his time, was kind of on the fence as to which way it would go. But still, the idea that he's putting these ideas out there, like all the computer stuff, like they were all spot on about all
Exactly.
that,
I mean, that's what's amazing about it. They were talking about personal computers, online shopping, autonomous vehicles, self-directed education. I mean, the list of things that were planned for the city in some ways have happened or are about to happen now.
Many of them, yeah.
Right.
And we tend to focus on the ones that they got right, and then of course they wanted a mile-wide dome.
Yeah, right.
And I'm
the
not sure if
dome
that
or
one
the,
is
or the nuclear power plant.
Yeah, or the nuclear power plant.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of those things have fallen out of favor, but some of them, it's interesting if you look at a neighborhood like. It was a news item about a couple months ago. Google's neighborhood in Toronto, right? Alphabet is building a new neighborhood or redeveloping a neighborhood, and they're trying to develop it with kind of smart city or eco-friendly kind of development. And a lot of the solutions that they have on offer are very similar to the experimental city. They're talking about underground infrastructure. They're talking about a fully wired city, of course, with it being Google. And even the language that a lot of these kind of new smart eco-cities are using, the idea of experimentation, the idea of an urban laboratory, that's a very popular kind of idea amongst a certain segment of urban planners these days. So in many ways, there's a kind of currency to these 50-year-old ideas.
Right. And Disney, of course, with Epcot, also had this idea of an experimental city.
Oh, it's amazing. Like if you go back and you look at the original Epcot, so not the Epcot that, we all know and, it's mildly entertaining, but like Disney's original plan for Epcot, experimental prototype community of tomorrow that he put forward in 1966. It's on YouTube. I would encourage you to get on YouTube if you have any kind of interest. Look up Disney's original pitch for this thing. It is almost identical to the experimental
So
city.
did it come before the experimental?
Same era.
Same era, like,
So
but it sounds like a
66.
year. Oh, is that, okay.
Yeah, they both came out of '66, and what that says to me, there was no communication between them. What that says to me is like this was the best thinking of the time. You know, Disney of course enlisted a bunch of experts as well.
Yeah.
You know, and so the thinking of the time was that this was the best way to solve urban issues was through these kinds of technologies. And certainly, if you're like a technologist like Spilhaus or Walt Disney were, then this was the kind of path that you took. And interestingly enough, two of the people that we talked to for the documentary that were on the Experimental City Authority, they recall Walt Disney Company actually coming up to Minnesota to question them about their experience with the experimental city as they're beginning development on Epcot. They wanted to share notes.
Right.
And so these Imagineers came up and met with the engineers in Minnesota.
This is also the time where the new towns were starting, like Reston and Columbia. So in a way, this idea of starting over, going to a rural place and building a city from scratch was also in the air at that time.
Absolutely. The idea of population being out of control and, you know, like rather than having kind of a suburban sprawl, so if you keep on adding to the megalopolis, there's no commitment at all whatsoever to people returning to the center core of the city. You know, that's something that's happened over the past 20 years. There was no way that was going to happen. You know, so you're either going to add on to the existing city. You know, people were moving into cities from all over the countryside. Right. That was taking place. So you either got to put them on the sprawl, right, or you put them in a new spot. And so Reston, Irvine, all these places, the idea was let's try it from scratch. Let's build it fresh and new. And that was a very, very current idea as well. Now, the experimental city, they were very aware of all of these other developments, and they just simply viewed those projects as either boring or simply not going far enough. Like there was just especially like something like Reston. They knew Reston was just going to be subsumed by the rest of the Washington, D.C. area, same with Columbia, and as this happened, absolutely. Right. Yeah. And Irvine, of course, as well. And so that's, you know, the primary reason why they wanted to put it out, you know, 100 miles outside of the city was that it would not become a bedroom community.
Right. You know, seeing the film today with some of the issues we're dealing with, like the tension between urban and rural communities, the tension between experts and the general population also comes out here where, you know, these sort of experts from the city were going to just dump this city on this population in Aiken County. And no wonder they responded the way they did. I mean, the process was very peculiar in that sense, right?
Well, the process was the process as it was done throughout most of the 1960s. It was, you know, top-down kind of approach. If you think of like, you know, a project like the Apollo program or, you know, like this big kind of crash program driven by experts. You get together this group of experts and, you know, they implement this kind of massive project as quickly and, you know, like not really cost effectively. They're just going to throw money at it, but like you're going to get it done. Right? And that was the thinking. And like everyone knows you don't get things done by going down, you know, to the grassroots. That takes forever. It's anarchy. It's slow, you know. And so like the idea is that you go top down, you get it done. And, you know, with the perceived urgency of the problem at the time, they felt that cities were going to be dead in 15 years if we don't do something about it. So I think probably the last thing you do is you go ask, you know, the person on the ground, what do you think? Yeah. You know, these experts felt they had the answers. Yeah. So, you know, and that's another instance where the kind of shifting sands of history kind of changed underneath this project where it became a much, much more grassroots. You know, we're used to kind of thinking like that. You know, we're kind of used to thinking that you have to have community involvement, whatever. You know, that comes out of this era, you know, and so like right as that idea is becoming the norm, or is becoming something that's expected, that's when the experimental city goes out and decides to build its city. And
timing wasn't all that great.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, another thing that you brought up in the movie was just the cost of this. So I did some calculations. So their $10 billion in today's money is $73.8 billion, which that was about the size of the Department of Transportation's annual budget. And double what NASA's budget was. I mean, their budget in 1967, NASA's was $5 billion, and they're asking for $10 billion, right? Yep. And the other thing is that when they said that they were going to raise 80% privately, of $73 billion, that's $59 billion they were planning on raising privately. Yeah. So it's the scale of it was enormous.
Well, so like when you think of like raising here, like, and I was like the line that Jim Alcott talks about when he's talking about you're going to build people are going to need to build houses
Anyway.
and schools and infrastructure anyway. So that $70 billion, it may not cost $70 billion to build a suburb, but it's going to cost a lot to house those, hundreds of millions, or not, tens of millions of people who are, coming into the population at the time. And so, the thinking was that this is an investment. This is an investment. It's a costly investment, no doubt. But the way that the cities were going at the time, it was, clear that the suburbs weren't working, and people aren't going to move to the inner city. So like, what are you going to do? Well, you start from scratch and you find a better way of doing it. So that at least was the thinking. I mean, that in many ways, that to me is one of their more compelling arguments. You're going to spend all this money, the trillions of dollars anyway. So why not go ahead and try out, even if their methods are like a little bit foreign to like the way we might approach them today. At least like they were thinking, okay, well, we maybe need to do some experiments rather than just like have private developers develop willy-nilly on some farmland out here.
Right.
And like the result is the result,
Right.
So I can see it. I mean, I really do kind of see like where they're coming from there.
Well, and Spilhaus's basic idea still seems legitimate, that we spend a lot of money on cities and we never do experiments. We sort of do the experiment by building it and then seeing what happens, and when it doesn't go well, too bad.
Yeah,
You
right.
know.
And then, sometimes it's documented what went right, what went wrong. Other times, like, no one really learns from it,
Right.
So, yeah, here's something that you would actually have a kind of data-driven kind of approach where you would have, like, as much as you could in a city with real-life people. The idea was that you would have something that would be informed, like science and technology. It's informed. That kind of development is informed, whereas urban development in many cases in the United States, contrary to the way it was done in some other countries, wasn't really guided or thought through so much. It was just kind of developed on the private market and just kind of happened the way it happened, for reasons that had very little to do with the well-being of society or the kind of personal enrichment of individuals, but usually had more to do with profit.
Right, yeah. Well, one of the great things about screening this here is that we actually have some people in the audience who participated in this process. And so I'm going to look out to a few people who I know were part of this. I mean, Dewey, your name actually shows up in the movie, and Gar, you worked on it as a student. Are there others here who worked on it? So, well, what are your thoughts? Do you want to give some firsthand reflections on what it was like to be involved in this project? And do we need a microphone?
You can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Dewey Thorbeck, and I was involved in the very early stages when the federal money came through for the project. And so I was working really way behind the scenes and participating in some of the workshops and conferences that were put on. But Dr. Spilhaus, and you have to remember, in those days, the School of Architecture was in the Institute of Technology. So we were very strongly connected to the whole idea of technology. And Spilhaus, had a remarkable way of making you believe in the word experiment. And so it was very exciting for me to be a part of that period in the early stages. But then later on, when the federal money went away, then I was no longer involved. So, but you did a wonderful job in kind of going back through that very interesting process. And I like Grant Merritt a great deal as a person and what he did with MPCA, but he was not very good at kind of accepting the idea of experiment. But by that time, like you say, it was very much of a top-down deal, not the way Spilhaus was originally kind of envisioning it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you for tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. Just very briefly about the kind of top-down nature. Absolutely, it was a top-down nature project. But as the project developed and as they began thinking about a lot of things, we just couldn't get into the film. But like one of the more interesting discussions that we heard was discussions about resident participation. So the idea was, and that was a very popular idea in the late 60s, early 70s, how do we incorporate the viewpoints of the residents to allow the city to kind of shift, And so like as it begins to change, how do we How much do we allow resident feedback? The idea was that you had to have resident feedback because you wanted to understand, it's kind of like a survey. You wanted to understand what they were, thinking in order to adapt the city to their needs. But at a certain point, they also understood that residents, once they become residents for a while, they become very residential. And they like to kind of settle down and they like to do things the way they were. Does that compete with the idea of a continuously changing city? So we had all sorts of things that we couldn't get into the film, but that particular discussion was about governance and about, community involvement was one of the more interesting ones.
Yes, go ahead.
How does the city within the city, Cedar Riverside, fit into this era?
This Cedar Riverside as well as Jonathan, which you may recall, maybe not, but Jonathan essentially became Chaska, or at least was absorbed by the city of Chaska. Jonathan was also a new town. It was actually the very first new town in the country to be awarded federal funds for its new town status. The experimental city folks very closely followed these projects with the idea that we could learn. Of course, they're scientists, and the hope is that they could learn from those projects, especially Jonathan. They actually had a group of history majors go down there to kind of document the development of Jonathan with the idea that the experimental city could learn from it. Cedar Riverside, I heard a little bit of discussion about it, but it wasn't something that I think the planners thought about as much as Jonathan, partly because Cedar Riverside was in the existing city, so they felt that it would be less relevant to what they're doing, whereas Jonathan, they felt it would become a bedroom community, which it did, but the thinking was that was kind of one of those newish towns that's on the outskirts of the city as opposed to the city within the city with Cedar Riverside.
Yeah, I mean, Cedar Riverside was part of HUD's experiment of doing a new town in town. So instead of building out in the rural areas, I think there was this idea that you would do it in the city itself.
Mm-hmm. Kind of it was an attempt at urban revitalization.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. A little bit later, though, more in the 70s.
I think so, yeah. No, it was something that I think was maybe being proposed or something. I remember hearing but definitely Jonathan, that was absolutely on their radar. And they were in many ways, they were very dismissive of Jonathan because it didn't have the same kind of scope and scale that they were after. Even the British new towns, which was a moderately successful experiment, depending on who you talk to. Again, they felt that, putting these cities well outside, putting a green belt around them was a great idea. But, something like Milton Keynes, they were dismissive of. It just wasn't going far enough. What are you going to really learn from that about, the future? These
Right.
people were, on a different stratum altogether,
Right. Yeah, yeah. Gar, you were a student that worked on this, right? Do you want to say anything about what that felt like? And built the models for it, right?
Yeah, this was a real thrill. I didn't quite know what to expect, but our model is in your film.
Right on.
And my memories are that besides, so I think Walter Viverette ran the kind of the sweatshop for this effort. So we were the sweaters, and I remember taking off one Saturday. We were working on the model, working on our presentations, and we went over to watch the Gopher football practice, spring game. We kind of slinked over to Memorial Stadium and started to watch, and we became aware of somebody over to our right who was looking at us, and it was Ralph Rapson, and he looked at us and said, "Boys, what are you doing here?" We as students, we spent a lot of time with futurists who were at the U and much in vogue at that time, and they pointed out some of the things you guys have mentioned about where society was going, where technology was taking us, and so we had two teams. And our team worked on the idea that interactive communication was coming and choices in all things. Finally, just listening and thinking about this and the public acceptance and understanding, it's too bad somebody doesn't mount this again with today's technology because you can imagine and show people so clearly what can be. And back then we were cutting with cardboard, and took a long time, Ralph, to do those things. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Over here. Go ahead.
It's interesting the lack of a organic development and a kind of a grassroots growth to the city, and also a kind of a dryness to it that doesn't deal with racism, for example, and how racism has affected the core of our inner cities. And that didn't seem to be any discussion in this film about the social problems that were caused by racism and economic inequality.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it's always a challenge to like fit as much as you can into 96 minutes, and you kind of have to ultimately like cut things out that you don't want to, just based on, you know, the format and like getting things down thematically. Ultimately, we wanted to make a film about environmentalism and these kind of two competing aspects of environmentalism. But race and class and segregation, segregation based on age, this was something that was deeply discussed in the project. In fact, you had this kind of conflict within the project between the more sociologically focused people. So a lot of sociologists were invited into the project, and they, of course, were focused on, you know, city planning from a human perspective, incorporating, you know, like a much more diverse population in the city, or at least, you know, like something that, you know, would meet more of our ideals today of what a city should be. But that was something that, and those people were always clashing with the technologists, right? The techno futurists who, you know, simply felt, well, we can't change people, we can't change society with this one futuristic city. What we can do is we can solve traffic, or we can solve whatever, but solving racism, it's foolish to think we could solve racism with technology, so why even begin to try? So, you know, you had these kind of techno-utopians, and you had the more kind of sociological utopians who were like, no, we should try that. You know, we should absolutely try that. So, you know, those conversations were very much a part of the Experimental City project. I don't know if they were at its core, but I think that they were something that, certainly on the fringes, were something that was perceived to be important. Spilhaus himself was very interested in the idea, I think just from the experimental rationale more than anything else, but the idea of the population of the city being reflective of the country as a whole, and certainly no ghettos, right? The last thing you'd want in an experimental city. Why would we, you know, and that was one of the promises here, is that you could have an integrated population if you started from scratch. That was at least the thinking, right? But then, of course, you'd still have people and Americans living in at that point, and in many ways, our cities were a reflection of the choices that Americans were making, as well as governments were making at the time, and so you may have ended up with ghettos again, simply if you didn't have any sort of enforcement of, you know, like planning or whatever.
Right, and Whitney Young was on, I mean, there were, you know, leading African-American spokesperson for civil rights was on the steering committee, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, yeah, and Whitney Young was a strong advocate for a very diverse community, not just in terms of race and economy, but in terms of like lifestyles and experiences. You know, he really wanted this city to kind of reflect the aspirations of incorporating everybody's potential viewpoint, not even just like viewpoints as they existed, but every conceivable viewpoint. He's like strong advocate for that. And again, those are just things that you just hate to cut out, you know? It's so interesting to listen to. Someday I joke that I'm gonna make a like 8-hour podcast about this thing, because we already got the audio, you know? So it's just a matter of like shaping that into a longer form story. But yeah, you know, we just focused ultimately on whatever. Another kind of question that we get that, you know, it's unfortunately just have to cut out, is like, what kind of jobs are they going to have? I didn't see any discussion of jobs in the film. So like, of course, the people didn't think about jobs. They thought about jobs. They thought about everything you guys would ever think of. They thought about it.
90,000 jobs they were anticipating.
Absolutely. You know, and the kinds of jobs that they generally tended to think of were, like they were following in the footsteps of Columbia, Maryland, and Irvine, California, where it was going to be kind of aerospace manufacturing, or medical fields, or education. So these kind of cutting edge kinds of jobs, they felt, you know, it was perfectly rational to put those in the experimental city, because, we're going to be building new cities anyway, if all these cities are going to look kind of like, or at least use the technologies of the experimental city, we might as well go ahead and build those technologies here in the experimental city anyway. And you'd want to have the industry there because the industry would want to kind of research and develop these systems that would be utilized as well. So that was the kind of thinking for jobs. Of course, they never got very far because, you know, they didn't, you know, they had to select the site first. But you know, these workshops, I think they had like 25 workshops, and just about every single aspect of human urban experience you could imagine was addressed in these workshops.
In some ways, it came too late. In other words, the environmental movement sort of worked against it. But in some ways, didn't it come almost too early? Because now you think about telecommuting, and you could probably have 90,000 jobs in Aiken County with people just, you know, doing work remotely.
Yeah,
And so, in a way, just with the solar energy, you could probably power that city with solar energy now, even though you couldn't back in the 60s.
No, absolutely. There's no way that city would have been powered back then. Yeah, no, a lot of the things that they proposed, and I think that the feeling was that they would grow into those technologies as well. That this city would not only like implement the newest technologies, but it would also act as a kind of testing ground, proving ground that would further develop these technologies much quicker. See, we know from retrospect that it took, what, 50 years to get smartphones, you know, but they figured they'd have them in like 10 or 15. You know, they don't, you know, like they just assume. And if you look at the, you know, I always like to like look back and think about like the life that somebody like Athelstan Spilhaus led. He was maybe born in, roughly 1910 or whatever. So, you know, in his lifetime, he saw human beings fly the first airplane. And in that same lifetime, in 50 years, he saw them landing on the moon. You know, you figure if you look at that trajectory, you're like, well, you can do pretty much anything, you know? And so in many ways, things, I mean, we kind of feel technology and things kind of speeding up, but in many ways, the fastest growth of technology in terms of like real impacts on human lives took place during Spilhaus's lifetime. Things have slowed. There's a lot of like economists now looking at like the changes that have taken place in the economy and in the development of technology since the oil crisis in like 72 or so, and how that has declined sharply in terms of like actual real benefit to people's lives. You know, so, you know, I always think of that plane, you know, where people couldn't fly, and then the moon, and like what a great, unbelievable symbol for what technology can accomplish in a lifetime.
Yeah.
And they saw that and they figured, well, okay, well, let's continue on that trajectory.
Other question here?
Are you aware of any projects of this scale that are taking place around the world today?
Yeah, I am. So there are several. None of which are in the United States. So I mentioned earlier the Google project. So they're trying to develop a neighborhood. It's certainly not building a whole new city, and probably for good reason. That's a little bit crazy. But there are cities that have been developed. If you want to talk about a nice, sterile, futuristic city, Songdo, South Korea is a great example of that. They built it with a lot of the same ideals as the experimental city. It would be pollution-free. There would be this awesome waste management system built into it. It has this kind of roughly underground infrastructure. And so Songdo, they're having trouble bringing people to that city. You know, same kind of thing. You build this like awesome new city, but then like, you know, maybe the people don't want it because it's sterile or whatever.
Asdar City is having the same problem in the, you know, in the Emirates. Yeah, they've built it, but nobody wants to actually live there.
And I'm trying to think of other major projects. Those are the big ones that have gotten off the ground. I know there's one in Kenya. It's a linear city, so it actually runs along the transportation route. I can't remember, Kongdo something, I think it is, but no, that's Songdo, no. But yeah, no, there are cities, and interestingly, I think even if there aren't massive like kind of projects like this, I think there is, like I mentioned earlier, there is a kind of shift amongst a certain breed of urban planner that is looking to utilize technology to its maximum in the development of cities, in the monitoring of cities, to like figure out how they work. You know, if you think of like something like Google Maps, something that we all pretty much use, that's amazing. That's magical. That is truly magical, the thing that we have. Now imagine that being that kind of functionality being built throughout a city where you can like really analyze, okay, where's the pollution coming from? Where is, you know, whatever it is you want to research, that kind of data that we carry around in our pockets with each individual us as a sensor, that leads to this magic that is Google Maps. Of course, there are privacy issues that we have to address with all those kinds of things, but the possibility there is extraordinary. So there are a lot of people out there who are looking at that kind of technology saying, wouldn't it be great if we could develop cities along those lines to utilize that technology that we have access to build something better? So yeah, the mentality is certainly out there for sure.
Yeah. Question here.
Well, yeah, it was great. Thank you. And so I knew a tiny bit about it because of Bucky Fleur's involvement, but it was a wonderful story. And so what occurred to me as I was listening to it, especially being really familiar with Bucky and his approaches to big, it was kind of the city as a machine, right? It was, fairly sterile. And the other thought that came along with it was, well, sure, all those guys, because they're mostly guys back in the day, had similar ideas because all of our visions of technology came from sci-fi. And sci-fi through the 60s was almost uniformly positive about technology, and it was all about technological utopias. Well, what happened after that? Well, then things started to go bad, and then we got all the dystopias. So the interesting thing to me, which I'd like to hear your comment on, is that then people like Jane Jacobs started talking about how the city is renewing itself. You need old buildings for new enterprises. And nowadays, transition towns are trying to rewire neighborhoods. And so is this a thing that I'm sensing in here that's happening over time with cities, or am I making too much of this?
I'm sorry, put a little bit finer point. Is what a thing exactly?
Well, that we're no longer thinking about these over-designed, if you will, projects where we have a plan, but rather we're viewing the city as maybe an ecology or something in the parts that changes, and it has a lot of involvement with the people, and they're changing it, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it's a new kind of an ecosystem-ish view of the city as opposed to a machine-like view.
Yeah.
Maybe am I getting closer?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think that even the very technologically inclined planners certainly wouldn't want to go back to that kind of like strict machine metaphor. I think the biological metaphor is one that is very well adapted to the current temper, and certainly one that is at least it creates the perception of human beings and systems working in some way that isn't repellent, So just as a metaphor, it sounds like, I think, a lot better to people. Now, in terms of the actual mechanics of the systems involved, I can see how engineers would be drawn to that machine metaphor, because most of these things are relatively simple kinds of things. But of course, once you're looking at whole societies and everything, yeah, I do think that at least, you may know better than I, like in terms of like the current thinking of planning, but my hunch is that it's going to be tough to go back from something that is much more looking at these things, at these kind of giant systems. Now, one thing that I would point out, and that we, again, you just wish you could get everything in there. These folks were very involved in something called systems, a systems technology, a systems approach.
Right.
Yeah, so like the idea of looking at all of these various systems of the city and looking at how one impacted another. So Spilhaus has this line in the film where he's talking about how if we build a communication system, then that will allow us then to not commute as much, because we won't need the transportation to be as effective. And then the city can kind of like collapse a little bit. It can become smaller, more dense. And then we don't need transportation again, thus further reducing pollution. And so that was kind of an example of Spilhaus's kind of systems approach, where he did view all of these things not necessarily as like cogs in the wheel, but like as things that referred to each other, where you did have this process of information or iteration and change as each adapted to one another.
Yeah, I mean, cybernetics was a kind of ecological model of systems that learn from each other. I mean, in some ways, you might be able to argue that we are doing the experimental city now pervasively everywhere, right? I mean, we are, a lot of these technologies are with us today, and it's just, we're all engaged in the experiment, rather than being just in Aiken County, which maybe is a better place to do it anyway, with all of us.
The difference, though, I think, and for better or worse, I'm not trying to advocate for an experimental city or even its approach, but I think the difference with the experimental city is that each of us with our phones and us as nodes in this kind of giant, vast network or whatever, there's no kind of overall kind of vision cohesively drawing it together. And I think one of the more compelling kind of thoughts that I've ever heard Spilhaus utter is, what they were really thinking about was each of us as individuals acts on a local level. We have to, I mean, you can't live like thinking about like every single impact that our lives will have on a vast level. We'll never get anything done. And what happens when everybody acts in their own kind of way is we end up with cities like we have now. In many ways, our cities are the result of each individual going out and doing their thing. And, one of the kind of compelling arguments for planning in general is that you need some sort of guidance if you want to have a hoped-for outcome, And that's very difficult, like, for, like, us now to, like, who are like kind of, who believe deeply in the idea of grassroots and, in many cases activism or whatever, to like accept that it's going to be very difficult to grassroots a project like global warming.
Right.
Like there's got to be like some sort of like kind of overall vision and overall plan for how to address that. And it's very frustrating because governments aren't doing the job there. And like technologists, who wants to trust them to do it as well, And so like, who do we look to? But, when you're thinking about these kind of large scale issues, like they result from the acts of each of us at a local level. And so like the tension that exists in the film, it's a tension about, localism versus globalism and how much we want to, allow the interests of individuals at the, grassroots level to control what happens on a global level,
Right.
And that tension, I don't have a right answer there. There is no right answer.
It's still with us.
Yeah,
It's
but
very much-
it's deeply important, I mean, global warming starts local and, scales up global very quickly.
Right. We have maybe time for one more question, so go ahead.
From a learning perspective, do you think there's anything that could have been done that would have made it successful? For example, 250,000 people to me sounds like a very large number for an experiment that's big today. Do you think that size could have been compromised or other things?
If it was smaller, it would have been more successful?
I think it would have much greater chance of success. Had it been 10,000, 15,000, I mean, 250,000, it would have been the, second or third biggest city. I mean, outside of the metro area, it would have dwarfed Duluth, or Rochester. So, massive city. So yeah, I think that would have helped. I think obviously then that would have brought down the budget quite a bit. So, changing the name, honestly. At a certain
The
point,
location, too?
Yeah, and I mean, but Aiken County, like that was, they did that based on research, and like the idea was that would be the most receptive because of economics. They were appealing to that kind of local concern.
Right.
People just they cared about jobs. They wanted jobs, and so like there were 50% of the people in Aiken County wanted it. It's just that the more vocal majority, or the more vocal percentage of that, were the people who like last thing they wanted was a futuristic city dropped on top of them. So I don't know. I mean, I think in many ways, if there was a possibility of something like it occurring, then chances are Otto and the people that were behind it probably would have figured out something to continue on. But the fact that this project didn't continue on at the same scale shows to me that the project by that point was just like of a completely different era. That things had so radically changed in those 8 years that the experimental city was around to make that kind of project look like Buck Rogers. So I don't know. I rack my brain. There may be smarter people that may have a better answer than that, but I just don't think so.
Yeah. Well, Chad, thank you. This is a great work, and thank you for letting us all know about our own history the way you've done here tonight. And please join us in the lobby afterward for a reception and for more conversations. So thank you, everybody, and thanks again, Chad.
Thank you. Thank you.